By the week before New Year's, Nolan Taro and Sabine Taro had started measuring time in paper. Not calendars, not clocks, but envelopes that arrived with quiet authority and bright red due dates. They were in their 70s, proud in the ordinary way of people who kept going without asking for applause, yet the last 2 years had worn their margins thin. Rent rose in small steps that added up faster than memory. Prescriptions never got cheaper, and the heater in their rental made a sour clank before it decided to work. Nolan tried to treat it all like math, because math feels controllable, but his hands tightened at the grocery checkout anyway. Sabine pretended she didn't notice when he chose store brands and put the nicer coffee back. What she wanted was not a miracle and not a luxury. She wanted one good evening that felt like their old life. New Year's supper on a table that looked cared for, with short guest lists of people who still saw them as steady, capable, and present. The stakes weren't cinematic, but they were sharp in the way real life is sharp. Because another year of shrinking would make them smaller than they recognized. They had never been gamblers, and that mattered to them as a point of identity. Nolan had spent decades doing maintenance work, fixing problems by checking the basics first and never trusting quick promises. Sabine had worked in a library, where careful records saved you from false stories, and where the slow truth usually outlasted the loud one. Still, on winter evenings, they watched storage auction videos on an old laptop balanced on a tray, not because they believed in jackpots, but because the calm bitter soothed them. They liked the ones who moved slowly and showed respect for rules, the ones who photographed everything and spoke about receipts like they were safety rails. Sabine would pause the screen when a unit looked neatly packed and say, softly, that somebody had once loved those things, even if light had forced them to leave. Nolan would point at furniture legs under dust sheets and note the difference between solid wood and cheap pressboard, the way he used to read machines by sound. One night, after a video where the bidder donated most of a unit instead of chasing profit, Nolan tapped the thumbs up without thinking, then subscribed so the channel wouldn't vanish. He left a short comment about doing things the right way, then cleared his throat as if kindness needed cover. Sabine saw it and smiled like she caught him being good when he thought no one was watching, and the smile turned into a decision neither of them said out loud yet. The notice didn't come with flashy graphics or promises, which was part of why it felt safe. Sabine found it on a community board near the grocery store entrance, half hidden behind church dinner flyers and snow shoveling ads. A lean sale at a storage facility on the edge of town, sold as is, door lift only 48 hours to clear. The date landed 2 days before New Year's, when most people were either distracted or tired, and that timing made Nolan pause longer than he meant to. They didn't talk about luck, because that word sounded childish at their age, but they did talk about numbers. Sabine counted cash twice and sealed it in an envelope with their maximum written on the front, like a boundary made physical. Nolan cleared the trunk the way he used to prepare a work van, leaving space for boxes and keeping 2 blankets for fragile items. Sabine packed gloves, a thermos, and her spiral notebook, because if they did this, she wanted their choices to make sense later. Their plan was simple and believable, yet emotion leaked into it anyway. Nolan pictured a sturdy dining set he could clean and resell, and Sabine caught herself imagining real plates instead of mismatched ones, then felt embarrassed for wanting something so basic so badly. The storage yard on auction morning smelled like cold concrete, exhaust, and weak coffee. A thin winter sun sat behind clouds, bright enough to show every scuff and warm enough to help nothing. Regular buyers moved through the rows with practiced indifference, scanning for profit the way some people scan for exits. Nolan and Sabine stayed a step back, close enough to see and far enough to think, and Nolan watched the crowd as much as the doors. Units opened to usual disappointments. Broken furniture, loose clothes, black contractor bags that made people laugh and step away. Then they reached a door near the far end where wind slipped through a gap in the fence and made the metal panels hum. Inside, the stacks were neat, not museum perfect, but careful in a way that suggested intention. Several large pieces of furniture sat under canvas tied with cord, their outlines clean and solid. Boxes were labeled in small handwriting with room names and dates, not junk or miscellaneous, as if someone expected a return with a checklist. A dry cedar scent drifted out, the smell of wardrobes and time stored too long. The crowd hesitated, because neat boxes take time, and time is what resellers guard. Nolan felt Sabine's sleeve brushes, steady and quiet, and he understood that the unit had already done something dangerous. It had made them care. Bidding started higher than Nolan liked, then cooled fast as the quick-profit buyers lost interest. One man in a cap tossed a lazy bid and smirked like he owned the place, but he didn't look at the unit long enough to respect it. Nolan kept his face neutral and his hand still, tracking the way the crowd leaned in and leaned out. Sabine didn't push with words. She touched his wrist once, anchoring him to the number on their envelope. Nolan lifted his hand and spoke their bid clearly, making sure the auctioneer heard him, then held steady as silence stretched. The man in the cap did a quick calculation that included fuel, labor, and dump fees, and his smirk thinned into a shrug. The gavel came down with a crack that felt too loud for a simple transaction, and suddenly Nolan's stomach tightened the way it did when a heavy machine started moving, and you realized you were responsible for where it stopped. In the office, the manager checked Nolan's ID, printed a receipt, and slid a brass key across the counter on a plastic tag. He repeated the rules in a tired voice. 48 hours. Keep the aisle clean. No leaving anything behind. And Nolan nodded like he was hearing a work order. As they walked back down the row, Sabine slipped her hand into his, and Nolan felt the strange truth of it. Winning didn't feel like celebration. It felt like stepping onto a bridge you couldn't see through the fog. At the blue door, the key warmed Nolan's palm through his glove, and the metal handle felt colder than it should. He slid the key into the padlock and turned until it clicked, then rested his hand on the corrugated surface for a second longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. The facility sounded normal in the distance. Someone's truck starting, a door rolling down, a muffled laugh somewhere down the lane. Yet this end of the row felt held, as if the air didn't want to move. Nolan lifted the door slowly to chest height, expecting stale dust and the flat smell of old cardboard. What drifted out instead was dry cedar and something faintly sweet, like cloth stored with care. Inside, the covered shapes and labeled boxes waited exactly as they had looked from the aisle, careful and patient, and Nolan's first emotion wasn't greed. It was the uncomfortable sense that they had stepped into someone else's paused life. He was about to lift the door higher when a soft, contained shift came from deep inside the unit, the sound of something sliding a fraction and settling again, like a drawer moving on its own. Nolan froze, and Sabine's eyes lifted to his face, reading the same question he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. If nothing was supposed to be moving in a locked room, then what exactly had just adjusted itself, and why did it feel like the unit had noticed them back? The next morning arrived clean and hard, the kind of winter light that made every mistake feel sharper. Nolan and Sabine came back to the facility with a clamp lamp, a step stool, 2 sets of gloves, and Sabine's spiral notebook held tight against her coat. Nolan told himself the sound from yesterday had been nothing more than with settling after a door lift, but he still unlocked the padlock like he was handling a live wire. When the metal door rattled upward, a cold breath rolled out that smelled of cedar, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like fabric stored with care. The neat stacks inside looked more real now than they had during the auction, because there was no crowd to blur the edges and no auctioneer to keep things moving. Nolan set the lamp near the threshold, angling warm yellow light toward the back, and Sabine paused long enough to write the time and date at the top of a fresh page. They didn't step in right away. Nolan listened for a second, and when nothing shifted, he nodded once as if giving himself permission. The first rule they agreed on quietly was simple. Nothing gets rushed, and nothing gets handled without being recorded. The second rule, equally important, lived behind Nolan's ribs where his pride usually sat. If this turned out to be worthless, they still had to clear it in 48 hours or pay penalties they could not afford. That pressure made his stomach tight, even as the unit's careful order kept tugging at Sabine's empathy in a way she couldn't quite explain. They began the way Nolan had always solved problems in his working life, with the least personal items first. Sabine photographed each stack before touching it, then copied every label into her notebook in tidy block letters, leaving space for notes and counts. Kitchenware, holiday linens, books, office, receipts/insurance, and one smaller box marked only with a date and 2 initials that Sabine underlined twice because it felt deliberate. They opened the holiday linens box first, because cloth doesn't bite, and because it helped them settle their nerves. Inside were folded table runners, cloth napkins with faint stitch initials, and old string lights carefully wrapped around cardboard, the kind people keep when they're attached to a certain glow. The kitchenware box held heavy glass tumblers with soft blue tint at the rim, stacked with cardboard dividers like someone expected them to survive transport. Sabine recognized them as the kind collectors ask for at flea markets, and her shoulders loosened by a fraction, not from greed, but from relief that they hadn't bought trash. Nolan lifted one bowl and tapped it lightly with a fingernail, listening to the clear ring the way he used to listen to a motor. The sound was clean. Nothing cracked. Nothing smelled wrong. Even the cardboard smelled dry, like a closet that had been cared for. They kept going box by box, opening only what made sense. Books wrapped in brown paper, a small set of framed photos face down to protect the glass, and a binder of appliance manuals that made Nolan exhale because it was the most normal thing in the world. When they reached receipts/insurance, Sabine didn't open it. She set aside and wrote, "Later, lass," because some boxes should be treated like private rooms. Once they'd proven the unit wasn't junk, they turned to covered furniture, and the tone changed from cautious sorting to careful inspection. Nolan untied the cord on the tallest piece first and pulled the canvas down slowly, revealing a narrow wardrobe with a curved top and a finish worn smooth where hands had touched it over years. The cedar smell rose stronger, clean and dry, and Nolan's mind immediately pictured what the piece would sell for if it were solid and stable. Sabine leaned close and noticed an old shipping label clinging to the back panel, faded print, and an overseas address that looked older than most of their furniture home. There was also a custom stamp of the year that made Nolan's eyebrows lift, not because he knew prices, but because he knew time has value. They moved to the dresser next, and when Nolan pulled the canvas away, he found heavy hardwood and dovetail joints that looked hand-cut rather than factory stamped. The drawers slid smoothly, and the scent inside was faint lavender, like someone had stored sachets to keep things fresh. The drawers were mostly empty, lined with pale paper, as if the owner had cleaned them out with intention. Nolan eased the third drawer back in, and that was when he felt a soft resistance that didn't match wood. He pulled it out again and ran his palm along the back panel, finding a thin seam that shouldn't have existed. He didn't force anything. He moved the dresser a few inches into the lamp's light and pressed gently along the base. A narrow strip gave by a fraction, springing back like it was designed to be pushed. Sabine held the lamp steady, while Nolan used a small flat screwdriver to ease the strip loose without splintering it, moving with the careful patience of someone who has broken enough things to hate breaking them. The panel slid aside to reveal a shallow felt-lined channel, and inside sat a velvet pouch and a paper-wrap bundle tied with brittle twine. Nolan's mouth went dry. Sabine's pen hovered above the page. Then she forced herself to write before her nerves could change the story. They didn't celebrate, and they didn't whisper like characters in a movie, because Nolan knew excitement makes hands clumsy. He set the bundle on a towel, unwrapped it first, and 2 heavy coins rolled into his palm, dull with age but crisp enough at the edges to look real. Sabine leaned in close, and the lamp caught worn lettering and a date that made her inhale sharply, not because she loved coins, but because the number looked like it belonged in a museum case, not in the base of dresser. Nolan placed the coins on the towel like fragile legs and opened the velvet pouch with a careful pinch. Inside was a ring of old gold with a dark red stone and an engraved crest that looked more like a family seal than something bought at a mall. It wasn't huge and it wasn't flashy, but it had weight, and weight meant value and responsibility at the same time. Sabine wrote, "Hidden compartment, dresser base." 2 old coins, 1 ring with crest, and drew a box around the sentence like the shape to contain her nerves. Nolan photographed the items beside the day's newspaper he brought in his truck, then sealed them in a zip bag and labeled it with a unit number and date, because turning a discovery into a record made it feel safer. They forced themselves to keep working, because the worst thing they could do was stop here and let their minds race ahead of their paperwork. Nolan checked the low sideboard next, tapping panels lightly and listening for hollow spaces, finding nothing at first except solid joints and old brass hardware. Then they uncovered the long, low-shaped Sabine had noticed at the auction, and it turned out to be a cedar chest with iron straps and a decorative lock plate. Nolan lifted the lid slowly, and inside were folded textiles stacked with care, plus a flat wooden case tucked beneath them, corners reinforced with tarnished brass. The case was small, but it felt heavy the way small things do when they're full of metal. Nolan opened the wooden case and felt his pulse jump before he even saw what was inside. Wax paper bundles of coins lay stacked like someone had counted them and put them to bed. Designs visible enough to show foreign lettering, and shields that Sabine didn't recognize. Beneath the top layer sat a folded sheet of thick paper, brown at the edges, marked with faint ink lines that looked like curves and angles rather than handwriting. Nolan didn't unfold it. He didn't even lift it fully, because the paper looked brittle enough to tear, and because a document like that could be more trouble than the coins on top of it. Sabine took photograph from above and wrote, "Wooden case and cedar chest. Multiple coin bundles, folded sheet underneath, do not open." Then underline the last 3 words twice. They rewrapped the bundles, closed the case, and placed it back under the textiles, trying to return the unit to a calmer state, even as their own nerves rose. When Nolan stepped back toward the doorway to breathe, he noticed a scrape line on the concrete just inside the entrance, fresher than the settled dust around it, like something heavy had been dragged recently. Sabine noticed it too and went still, her eyes moving from the scrape to the corridor outside. Down the row, near where the security camera view seemed to end, a figure stood half turned toward them, hands in pockets, posture casual in a way that felt practiced. Nolan kept his face neutral and lowered the door a few inches as if they were simply taking a break, because he understood a quiet truth that tightened his chest. The secrets in that furniture weren't accidents, and if someone else already knew what was hidden in the cedar chest, then Nolan and Sabine weren't the only people watching this unit anymore. Nolan didn't stare back at the watcher, because he'd lived long enough to know that eye contact can turn a stranger into a conversation. He lowered the metal door until it was just above knee height, then paused as if deciding what to do next, letting his posture say routine instead of alarm. Sabine stayed close and kept her notebook tucked under her arm, her face calm by effort, because calm was a kind of cover. They walked to the office at the same unhurried pace they'd used all morning, returning the clamped lamp for a minute, buying time under bright fluorescent light and other people's indifference. Nolan asked the manager in a neutral voice whether there had been any staff access to their corridor since the auction, and the man's answer was careful without being comforting. "The cameras covered a gate in the main lanes," he said, "but not every row, and the facility relied on lock changes and renter codes more than constant eyes." Nolan thanked him, paid for an extra day of access just in case, then stepped back into the cold with a key in his pocket that suddenly felt like a liability. In the parking lot, Sabine placed her gloved hand on Nolan's sleeve, not to stop him, but to anchor him as his thoughts started to sprint. They loaded the zip bag with the 2 coins and ring into an ordinary tool tin under a blanket, because expensive things should not look expensive in daylight. On the drive home, the town looked normal in a way that felt almost insulting. Holiday lights, slow traffic, a grocery sign blinking cheerfully, while Nolan's mind kept replaying the scrape mark and that distant figure standing where the cameras ended. By the time they pulled into their small driveway, Nolan had already made the quiet decision that their house would not become a hiding place, not even for one night. That evening they made the situation boring on purpose, because boredom is what keeps trouble from growing teeth. Nolan dug out a small fire box he used for documents and receipts, placed the coins and ring inside only long enough to organize them, and then resealed everything into a plain envelope labeled with the unit number and date. Sabine printed a photograph from her phone and added them to the same packet, along with a simple timeline written in clear ink. Auction, first opening, hidden compartment in dresser, wooden case and cedar chest, scrape on concrete, unknown watcher at the far end. They didn't argue and they didn't spiral into what-ifs, because they both knew what panic does to older bodies, and because they still had a unit to clear or convert. The next morning, as soon as the bank opened, Nolan rented a small safe deposit box without telling a story, keeping his voice mild and his eyes down, while Sabine waited in the car with the envelope hidden under an old sweater. The clerk didn't ask questions, and Nolan didn't offer answers. Banks are built for quiet secrets, and that was the point. They stored only the portable valuables and the printed photos, leaving the wooden case and folded paper out of sight at home for the moment, because moving everything at once felt like advertising. From there, they drove back to the storage facility and signed a month-to-month rental agreement for the unit, buying time and removing the pressure of a 48-hour sprint. The manager printed a basic access log showing gate code entries and times, which was useful without being reassuring. And Nolan asked him one more practical favor. A quick walk down the corridor together, just to make it clear they weren't working in isolation. As they walked, Sabine's eyes tracked the dust on the concrete the way she used to track footprints in snow, and she saw what she didn't want to see. A faint crescent scuff behind a stack of boxes near their door, fresh enough to suggest someone had stood there recently and turned in place. Nolan didn't say out loud, but his jaw tightened as if the thought had weight. Someone had been close to their unit. Close enough to wait. They needed to know what they were holding before they made any big move. So Nolan did the next sensible thing. The thing he wished he'd done earlier in life with every hard decision. He asked for verification from someone who made money on honesty, not speed. Sabine found a small numismatics and estate shop with a plain sign and a tired bell, not a loud neon place promising cash now, and they brought only one coin to ring, keeping the rest tucked away. The owner, a careful man with wire-rimmed glasses, handled the items with the kind of patience that calmed Sabine's breathing. He weighed the coin, checked the edge lettering, examined surface details under a loop, then set it down like it deserved rest. He didn't throw out a dramatic number. He spoke in trim, practical phrases. It appeared consistent with late 18th century Spanish silver. The ring looked like older gold with a hand-cut setting, and both would need formal testing for certainty. He offered two paths, neutral authentication through a conservator or a sale through his shop with paperwork, and he warned them that selling too fast would invite regret. Nolan asked about the folded paper without describing it as a map, and the man's expression sharpened slightly as if he'd heard that story before. He gave them a museum contact who did paper stabilization and ink analysis, the kind of professional who cared about provenance and documentation, not treasure. Outside in the cold, Nolan felt both relief and dread, because consistent meant they weren't fools, and testing meant their next steps would create records that other people might notice. In the truck, Sabine opened her notebook and wrote a new rule under the timeline. No pawn counters, no rush sales, everything documented. Nolan nodded once, and in that nod Sabine saw a choice that had nothing to do with money. Nolan was done being pushed by urgency, whether it came from bills, strangers, or his own fear. The house felt smaller that afternoon, not because anything had changed inside it, but because their awareness had changed. Nolan installed a cheap motion light over the back steps the same day, not as a declaration of war, but as a practical boundary, and Sabine replaced a flimsy gate latch with a sturdier lock that clicked with satisfying finality. They ate a simple dinner and tried to talk about ordinary things, but ordinary words kept slipping into silence, and silence kept making room for listening. When Sabine went to the mailbox after dusk, she found nothing dramatic, just bills and a local flyer, yet her hands still went cold as she sorted paper in the porch light. Nolan checked the street through the front window and saw only parked cars and winter darkness. Then his phone buzzed with voicemail from an unknown local number, and he played it with the volume low, Sabine leaning close enough to hear. The voice was calm and courteous, the kind that sounded professional until you listened to what it chose to mention. The caller said he represented a family estate that had lost personal property in a storage situation, and he offered to buy the old items for a fair cash amount to save you the trouble. Then he added, almost like small talk, that he hoped Nolan and Sabine were comfortable in the little place near the corner park, describing their neighborhood without naming it. The message ended with a simple request to call back that evening, because outside offers don't stay open. Sabine didn't scream or cry, but her mouth went dry, and Nolan felt a slow, controlled heat move through his chest. They saved the voicemail and did not return the call, because responding would confirm they were reachable, and reachability was leverage. Nolan wrote the number down, then placed the paper under the firebox key, like a promise to himself that they would do this in daylight and on record. Back at the unit the next morning, they worked as if time had become expensive again, not rushing, but refusing to drift. Nolan asked the manager to stand in the corridor for 5 minutes while they opened the wardrobe and seat her chest again. Not to accuse anyone, but to create witnesses without drama. Sabine photographed the lock, the door frame, and a scrape mark on the concrete, then aimed the clamp lamp toward the back as Nolan inspected the wardrobe with a gentle, methodical touch. The back panel's grain looked slightly mismatched along one vertical seam, and when Nolan pressed near a carved knot in the wood, he felt a soft give, like a latch disguised as decoration. A narrow section of panel slid aside, revealing a shallow cavity lined with cloth. Inside sat a leather pouch with foreign coins and a thin chain, plus a bundle of old papers wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine, a ration booklet, a discharge document, and a small stack of letters with addresses that matched the county they lived in. Sabine's throat tightened as she photographed each item, because letters are the kind of thing that make money feel irrelevant for a moment. Nolan didn't open the letters in the unit. He sealed them in a bag and wrote personal papers on the label, because he still believed in treating strangers like people. Under the cedar chest base, he found a second hidden feature, a narrow metal tube tucked behind a sliding panel, capped tight, the kind used to protect paper from moisture. He turned it in his hands and heard nothing rattle, yet the weight suggested more than air. Sabine watched Nolan's face and saw him struggling with the same thought she had. Whoever packed this unit didn't just hide valuables. They hid a trail, layered through furniture like a plan. As Nolan slid the tube into a padded tote and lowered the unit door again, the corridor felt colder, and the question Sabine couldn't stop holding became sharper than fear. If a calm stranger already knew where they lived, what exactly did he believe was inside that tube? And how far would he go to get it before Nolan? And Sabine could put it into professional hands. Nolan did not sleep much after the voicemail, not because he imagined footsteps in the dark, but because his mind kept replaying one calm sentence about their neighborhood until it sounded like a hand on a doorknob. Before dawn, he sat at the kitchen table with Sabine's notebook open, the clamp lamp aimed down like a spotlight, and he rewrote their situation into plain steps the way he used to handle building emergencies. Document, verify, relocate, report. The metal tube lay inside a padded tote beside the table, sealed and ordinary looking. Yet Nolan kept seeing it as a message someone expected him to read. Sabine made coffee and didn't try to cheer him up because cheer feels wrong when your nerves are doing honest work. They listened to house settle, to pipes ticking as the heat rose, and to the faint hum of the refrigerator, each sound familiar enough to keep them grounded. When daylight finally thinned the darkness, Nolan called a non-emergency line and reported the open gate, the moved items, and the voicemail, careful to sound factual instead of scared. The officer who returned the call gave him a case number and advised him to save all messages, install cameras if possible, and avoid direct contact with unknown callers. It was not a dramatic moment, but Nolan felt something loosen in his chest, because a case number turns fear into a file, and files can be followed. 2 hours later, they drove to the museum lab with only the tube, a folder of printed photos, and the one verified coin, leaving everything else in the bank box and the unit. Nolan parked in a spot visible from the main entrance, not out of paranoia, but out of habit, and Sabine kept the tote close against her coat as if cold air itself had ears. On the museum steps, with tourists walking past and a school group laughing near the fountain, Sabine whispered the question she had avoided saying at home. If someone was pressuring them this politely, what were they afraid Nolan would show to the wrong person? The conservator met them in a bright room that smelled faintly of paper and cleaning alcohol, wearing gloves like a uniform rather than a costume. Nolan explained in calm, trim phrases that the tube came from a hidden compartment in furniture from a lean unit, and that they needed neutral handling, not a headline. The conservator nodded and logged the items, photographing the tube on a clean mat, then cutting the old cap tape with a tiny blade that looked built for patience. When the cap loosened, the room held a particular quiet, the kind that happens when everyone understands that damage can't be undone. Inside the tube were rolled photographs, a thin bundle of typed pages wrapped in wax paper, and a small folded sheet with pencil marks that looked like quick field notes. Sabine watched the conservator unroll the photos under her weight, and her breath caught when a landscape came into focus, a river bend in winter light, a low ridge line, and narrow cut in the ground that looked like a drop-off, a place where the land fell away suddenly. Another photo showed the same spot from a different angle, with a wooden wagon and 3 men standing beside it, their faces half turned from the camera as if they didn't like being recorded. The typed pages were older than Nolan expected, their edges browned, the ink slightly faded, and the conservator's eyes sharpened as she read the heading twice before saying anything. She didn't name an exact year or price, but her tone changed in a way Nolan could feel. The pages appear to be field notes from a local survey project, and the language suggested a private research collection rather than a public report. The folded pencil sheet, when opened carefully, revealed a simple diagram of a bank in a bend, with a line under two words that made Sabine's stomach dip. Before the drop. The conservator asked whether they had found any maps or books connected to local routes, and Nolan admitted there were history volumes in the unit, plus a folded paper they had not opened. The conservator didn't push them to reveal more. She simply advised immediate chain of custody documentation and offered to connect them with a regional archivist who could evaluate the material without public exposure. As they gathered their things, a gray-haired consultant stepped into the room and listened for a minute, then offered one sentence that landed harder than any appraisal ever could. Materials like this attract people who want control, not truth. Nolan carried that sentence out of the museum like a weight, because it matched the voicemail too neatly to ignore. They drove straight from the museum to the sheriff's office instead of going home, because Nolan had learned the hard way that waiting turns problems into stories other people tell for you. In a small interview room with a humming fluorescent light, he played the voicemail for a deputy who listened without rolling her eyes, then copied the number and asked specific questions about the storage facility, the unit conversion, and the disturbed dust patterns. Sabine handed over printed photos and the conservator's receipt for the two contents, and the deputy's face stayed neutral in the way professionals practice when they don't want to scare older people. Nolan asked what he could do without escalating into chaos, and the deputy gave him practical answers. Keep the bank box, keep the case number, request any facility access logs available, and do not meet private representatives alone. She also suggested something Nolan hadn't considered, something that made his shoulders relax by a fraction. If the pencil note pointed to public land, any search should be done with a ranger or county official documented from the start, so nobody could later claim Nolan stole or staged anything. On the drive back toward the storage facility, Sabine stared out the window and tried to memorize ordinary details. Holiday banners, wet pavement, a man walking a dog. Because ordinary details keep panic from taking over. Halfway there, a dark sedan appeared behind them at a polite distance. Neither tailgating nor passing, just present in the mirrors long enough to become undeniable. Nolan didn't speed up, and he didn't test his luck with sharp turns. He drove into the parking lot of a fire station, parked beneath a visible security camera, and waited. The sedan rolled by without stopping, as if it had someplace else to be, and Sabine's hands trembled only after it was gone. Nolan stayed quiet until his breathing steadied, then told Sabine they were finished being nudged in private. If someone wanted a conversation, they could have it with paper and daylight, not with hidden numbers and polite threats. That afternoon, back at the unit, they worked with a different kind of urgency, the kind that doesn't rush hands but does not waste minutes. Nolan asked the manager for the basic gate access log again, added the time of the voicemail to his notes, and requested that any suspicious vehicles near their corridor be flagged if staff saw them. The manager couldn't promise much, but he agreed to walk the lane with them for a few minutes, and that alone changed the air, because predators prefer people who look isolated. Inside the unit, Nolan and Sabine shifted from curiosity to process, photograph, label, bag, and move any sensitive items into the bank box before nightfall. They opened the boxes of books and found what the labels promised: local water routes, early settlement roads, photocopied articles about a long-closed survey project. And Sabine felt a strange sadness in how carefully the owner had organized it all, like someone building a bridge for a future reader. Nolan inspected the sideboard and wardrobe again, tapping for hollow spots, checking seams, and following the logic of hidden access the way he would follow ductwork through an attic. Behind the decorative trim under the sideboard, he found another narrow cavity, and inside was a cloth packet holding old paper currency folded tight, plus a small brass key with a worn tag that read Depot Locker. Sabine stared at the tag as if it could blink. A depot locker was not a fantasy clue. It was a real, mundane place people use when they're moving fast and don't want things at home. Nolan photographed the key beside the day's paper, sealed it, and wrote the words in a notebook with a box around them, the same way she'd boxed hidden compartment earlier. They moved the most important bags to bank before dusk, leaving furniture and ordinary household goods behind, and Nolan locked the unit with a new padlock of his own, not because it was invincible, but because it would show obvious tampering. On the way back to the car, Sabine glanced down the row and saw nothing but doors and winter light. Yet her skin still tightened, as if eyes were on her. Nolan didn't tell her to relax, because he couldn't, and because he now understood the central shape of the mystery. The unit was not simply storage, it was a system, and systems usually protect something that isn't meant to be sold casually. By the next morning, the puzzle had turned into a route with 3 clear stops: Ranger, Archivist, and the depot. The Archivist reached through the museum, agreed to meet them at the county trails lot that afternoon with a ranger present, to review the before-the-drop reference against known sites, and to set ground rules for documentation if they needed to approach a location. Nolan brought only copies of photos and a pencil note, not originals, because originals belonged in controlled light, not on windy ground. The ranger was steady and direct, the kind of person who had seen enough lost hikers to respect comm plans, and he spoke plainly about where people could walk legally and where digging required permission. Sabine watched Nolan absorb each instruction like a lifeline, and she felt the strange tenderness of seeing her husband become careful in a new way, not because age made him timid, but because responsibility had finally become visible. They drove in a small convoy to a trailhead, then walked to a river bend that matched the photo more closely with every 100 yards, the air smelling of wet earth and cold water. When the land dipped sharply ahead, the phrase before the drop stopped being words and became a place, and Sabine felt a tight pinch of fear, because places could be visited by anyone, not just them. The ranger marked a safe approach and began scanning the ground for disturbed stones or old markers, while Nolan compared angles against the printed photo, his hands steady by will. They had not dug more than a few inches when Nolan noticed something that made his stomach go cold, a cluster of stones arranged too straight to be natural, and beside it, a fresh boot print pressed into damp soil, sharper than the others on the trail. The print was not theirs, and it was not the ranger's. Sabine looked up at Nolan and understood the question forming in his face, without him saying it. If someone else had been here recently, close enough to leave a clear mark, were they about to uncover history first, or were they about to step into a plan someone else had already started? Nolan held still as the ranger crouched beside the fresh boot print, measuring its depth with a gloved finger and scanning the slope like he was reading a page. Sabine kept her eyes on the brush line, not expecting a person to jump out, but refusing to pretend the mark was nothing. The archivist didn't dramatize it either, which somehow made it worse. She simply asked the ranger to photograph the print with a scale card, then to photograph the stones exactly as found. Nolan watched their calm teamwork and felt his own pulse slow, because it meant the day was no longer a private gamble. The ranger marked a small perimeter with bright tape and called in 2 deputies, not with sirens, just with procedure, and they arrived looking more tired than heroic, which made Sabine trust them more. The ranger cleared soil with a small trowel, careful enough that each scrape sounded intentional, and within minutes the tip hit something hard that didn't belong in river dirt. He exposed a weathered wooden box banded with metal, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff, then stopped and looked to the archivist for the next step. Nolan's mouth went dry, because the box looked exactly like the kind of thing people argue over later. The archivist had the deputies log the discovery as a documented historical find on public land. Then she guided the opening like it was evidence, not treasure. Inside were journals wrapped in wax paper, ledger books with careful columns, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and a smaller envelope marked with the same phrase Nolan had seen in pencil, before the drop. Sabine sat back on a flat rock, not crying, but breathing like someone who'd been holding a weight for days, and finally set it down. Whatever had been hidden was real, and now it belonged to daylight. They were still sleeving pages and photographing each bundle, when a car door closed above the ravine. The sound carried down the cut like a quiet warning. Nolan felt his shoulders tighten before he even looked up, and Sabine's hand found his sleeve without thinking. The deputies moved first, walking uphill with the ranger, and when they returned a few minutes later, they weren't alone. A man stood behind them at a careful distance, hands visible, posture polite, face set in an expression that tried to pass for concern. He spoke in a calm voice that sounded rehearsed, saying he represented an estate and wanted to help manage the return, and he offered a cash amount that was meant to sound generous without being specific. The archivist asked for documentation, and the man's confidence thinned by a fraction, the first honest crack Nolan had seen in days. One deputy kept the conversation short and dry. asking for ID, then telling the fine was logged officially, and any claim had to go through the county and state channels. The man tried to angle his gaze toward Nolan, as if Nolan might be the weak link, and Nolan didn't give him one extra inch of explanation. The deputy's tone stayed even when he said, "You need to step back and leave the site." The man did, but not before letting his eyes drift over Sabine's notebook and the evidence bags, like he was counting what he couldn't touch. When he finally turned away, Sabine felt her legs shake with delayed fear, and Nolan felt a different kind of relief. The pressure had been real, and now it had witnesses. The boot print made sense at last. Someone had come early, hoping to control the moment, and they had arrived too late, because Nolan and Sabine refused to play it privately. The next 48 hours unfolded the way real life does when adults insist on doing things correctly. Forms calls, receipts, and quiet rooms where people read carefully. The archivist arranged for the papers to be transported to a climate control facility, and Nolan watched the box disappear into official custody with a strange mix of loss and pride, because it no longer felt like his problem to guard alone. The museum issued a chain of custody letter for the photographs and typed notes from the tube, and the sheriff's office added the new encounter to the earlier case. The storage facility manager, seeing the seriousness in their faces, provided whatever access logs he could and agreed to call if any unfamiliar vehicles lingered in their lane again. Nolan and Sabine also did the boring safety work that kept their home from feeling like a target: a new gate lock, motion lights, and a small camera that saved to a card. They didn't turn their house into a fortress. They simply stopped leaving it soft. Once the officials took over, Nolan finally allowed himself to circle back to the depot locker key, because ignoring it felt like leaving a door half open. With a deputy aware of where they were going, they visited the station in midday traffic and opened a locker under security camera. Inside was a sealed document pouch, a thin stack of letters, and one plain envelope labeled with a name that wasn't theirs, plus a short note that explained the shape of the whole story. The unit's owner had been the last caretaker of a researcher's collection that went missing decades ago, and the hiding places were a crude insurance plan. If one layer was found, another stayed safe. The note didn't ask for drama or revenge. It asked for the work to be returned intact, and it apologized for the fear it might cause. When the state archives confirmed the collection's identity, the payoff was not movie money, but it was real and clean. Nolan and Sabine received a formal finder's reward funded through a preservation program, with paperwork that made the amount feel safer than any cash offer from a stranger. Separately, the antique furniture from a unit, beautiful even without secrets, was evaluated through a reputable auction house, and Nolan felt a quiet satisfaction watching professionals respect craftsmanship instead of treating it like a fast flip. They sold a few pieces with proper receipts and kept one small side table that fit their space, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded them that care can survive long storage and still look like care. The smaller coin finds from the hidden compartments were appraised responsibly, and a portion went toward their immediate needs without turning them into different people. They paid off the stubborn debts that had made every envelope feel like a threat, replaced a failing water heater, and built a modest emergency cushion, so the next winter wouldn't feel like a cliff edge. Sabine insisted on something else too, something quiet and meaningful: a donation in the original caretaker's name to the museum's conservation lab, because she couldn't forget the steady hands that kept history from becoming gossip. Nolan didn't argue, because he had learned in this process that dignity comes from choices you can explain later without flinching. The pressure call stopped once the archive was public and logged, proving the simplest truth Dr. Pike had hinted at earlier: shadows don't like paperwork. On New Year's Eve, the table Nolan and Sabine set wasn't fancy, but it looked cared for, and that mattered more than impressing anyone. They cooked a small meal, invited two friends who had checked on them without asking for details, and for the first time in months, Sabine didn't feel her stomach twist when a car slowed outside. Nolan still moved slower than he used to, and Sabine still wrote lists the way she always had. Yet their home felt like a place to live again, not a place to brace. The future they built from the reward wasn't loud. It was stable. Nolan took a light maintenance job a few mornings a week on his terms, and Sabine started quilting again without the tight fear of needing every sale. They volunteered at the museum on Saturdays, helping scan pages and label folders, and Nolan found he liked the quiet discipline of it, the sense that small, careful work could hold up something larger. When the exhibit opened in spring, their names appeared on a modest plaque as finders, and Nolan felt an emotion he hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly, but relief that decency had left a record. The moral of their story wasn't that luck rescues you at the last minute, or that hidden maps are a shortcut to a better life. It was that luck tests you, and the test is usually simple. When Nolan and Sabine were given a chance to cut corners, they chose procedure. When they were pushed to handle it quietly, they brought it into daylight. In the end, that choice protected them, protected the history, and gave them something older viewers understand deeply. A calmer year ahead, built not on thrill, but on doing the right thing when nobody could force them to. When winter finally loosened its grip, Nolan and Sabine noticed the house had stopped feeling like a place they had to defend. The motion lights clicked on like a normal convenience instead of a warning. The new latch on the gate shut with a solid, ordinary sound, and the small camera above the porch became just another object they stopped thinking about. They didn't talk about those tense days often, but they both felt the difference in their bodies. Shoulders that dropped more easily, sleep that didn't break at every creak, mornings that started without that tight pinch of dread. Sabine still kept list in her notebook. Only now the lines weren't only about bills and deadlines. They were about living again, seeds for the garden, a day trip when the weather softened, a simple dinner with people who still remembered them as steady. Nolan moved a little slower than before, but his eyes looked clearer, as if he reclaimed the right to breathe without counting the cost. By spring, the museum's small exhibit opened in a calm, respectful way, and that mattered more than any headline. Under the glass were the papers they had pulled back into the daylight. Notes, letters, route sketches, the kind of quiet history that doesn't shout but still changes what a town knows about itself. Nolan and Sabine stood off to the side, letting the professionals speak, letting the documents be what they were, and letting their names sit small on a plaque without turning it into a performance. People came up anyway, shaking their hands with a kind of gratitude that isn't about treasure, but about not letting something important be scattered or exploited. Sabine watched older visitors lean close to read the neat handwriting on a page and felt her throat tighten. Not from fear this time, but from relief that the story had landed somewhere safe. Nolan didn't smile wide, but he nodded often, the way he did when a job was finally done the right way and could now belong to time instead of worry. The money that followed, documented, appraised, handled through proper channels, didn't turn them into different people, and that was the point. It cleared the debts that had been creeping up behind them for years, repaired what had been put off too long, and created a small cushion that made winter feel less like an enemy. Nolan took a light maintenance job a few mornings a week, not because he had to scramble anymore, but because he liked having a purpose that didn't grind him down. Sabine returned to her quilting with steadier hands. Sewing because she wanted to, not because she was trying to stitch stress into something manageable. They kept one modest piece of furniture from the unit, a simple table that became their tea spot, less as a trophy and more as a reminder that careful choices can leave something warm behind. In time, the man who had tried depression became a file number in a memory, not a shadow on the street. Nolan would sometimes replay how easily everything could have gone wrong if they had rushed hidden things, or chased fast cash in the dark, and thought always ended the same way. They were okay because they refused to be alone with the problem. They asked for help, they wrote things down, they kept the story in daylight, and they treated what they found like responsibility before it was opportunity. When the next New Year's arrived, they set a small table without forcing cheer, and the evening felt honest in a way it hadn't for a long time. Their future wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and it was theirs, built not on luck alone, but on the decision to stay decent when it would have been easier to be quick.